Good morning and welcome to the Niskanen Center briefing on election takeaways. I'm Kodiak Hill-Davis, the Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen Center, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's discussion. A quick note before we get started, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We encourage all attendees to submit questions throughout the discussion, and our panelists will answer them at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce my Niskanen colleagues who will be leading today's discussion: Kristie Peña, Vice President of Policy; Geoff Kabaservice, Director of Political Studies; and Wilkinson, Vice President of Research. This election earlier this month was historic for a variety of reasons: record turnout, voters dealing with different modalities of voting, a global pandemic, a sitting president who has declined to concede, and our panelists will be covering the legal, policy, and political ramifications of a new administration, a closely divided House and Senate, the future options for the GOP and Democrats as polarization really increases and coalitions really become paramount to political action. And with that, I will turn it over to Kristie Peña to get our conversation started.
Hey, good morning, all. I will echo Kodiak's sentiments that there is a lot going on here. Usually when we're talking about presidential transitions, we're talking about the actual process of transitioning, who we're expecting to see as cabinet members, making sure the president is up to speed on lots of things. But of course, complicating things this time around is that over the past days and weeks, the president has been trying to delay certification of his loss to President-elect Biden with a flurry of lawsuits and affidavits that are supporting pretty widely unsubstantiated claims of election fraud. And I say unsubstantiated for a number of reasons, not least of which in nearly every state, and actually I think we can say every state now, there aren't enough votes at stake to change the results of the election. And the affidavits have, by and large, at least to this point, not passed even relatively light scrutiny. On Monday, 16 assistant U.S. attorneys charged with investigating irregularities in the election wrote to Attorney General Bill Barr saying that they had seen no evidence of substantial election fraud. So given that these suits are so far without merit, I don't want to spend too much time on the hundreds of lawsuits. I think there's been something like 300 lawsuits and affidavits filed, but I do want to give you sort of a quick overview of where we are right now. So just last week, the president suffered a handful of pretty decisive legal blows. Defeats were handed down in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, in Nevada, and in Michigan, where a state judge in Detroit rejected an attempt to halt certification of the vote in Wayne County, pending an audit of that count. And I think that's interesting, not just because it's a suit unlike any we've seen in recent memory, but because, for a party that decries judicial activism, it was sort of an ironic challenge. Even the judge in that case said that it would be an unprecedented exercise of judicial activism for a court to stop the certification process. By and large, these legal claims are sort of all over the map. The lawsuit in Arizona claimed that some of the ballots cast for President Trump were invalidated after voters in Maricopa County, which is the county that Phoenix is in, used Sharpie pens. I think that the internet is calling it Sharpiegate right now, which caused ink bleeds, and therefore those votes were unable to be tabulated. There has not been any evidence that was in fact the case. There are allegations in Detroit that Democratic poll workers were coaching voters, that Republican poll challengers were not given adequate access to monitor the vote count. But by and large, like I previously mentioned, these affidavits that are coming in from individuals aren't really withstanding judicial scrutiny. Specifically in the case in Detroit, there was an affidavit that was dismissed after they found out that poll worker had posted on Facebook before the election about the election day fraud that was going to happen. To date, SCOTUS has refused to accept Trump's attempt to challenge Pennsylvania's 3-day extension that was upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And most recently, a Georgia challenge was quickly rejected for a lack of evidence after a declaration by the Department of Homeland Security saying that the election was, and I'm quoting here, the most secure in American history, and there is no evidence of any voting system malfunction. An interesting trend that I want to note that's emerging along the legal community is that attorneys across the firm have been disparaging the lawyers and the law firms that are making some of these unfounded claims in court, citing a general ethical obligation of candor to the court. The lawyers defending American democracy recently collected something like 1,100 signatures on their open letter that were denouncing some of these baseless lawsuits. And perhaps coincidentally, or perhaps not, recently an Ohio-based law firm, Porter, Wright, Morris, and Arthur, withdrew from their lawsuit supporting or made on Mr. Trump's behalf in Pennsylvania, citing some of the internal tensions that their firm was seeing about its work to undercut the integrity of the electoral process. And of course, most recently, we have seen allegations that Senator Lindsey Graham had reached out to the Secretary of State of Georgia to encourage him to throw out ballots where the signatures could potentially not be validated. I know that is a breaking story, so we don't have all the details on that yet, but certainly that would present a worrisome conversation. So what has the administration done? In President Trump's COVID speech last Friday in the Rose Garden, he said, "Whatever happens in the future, who knows which administration, I guess time will tell." But he bounced back pretty quickly from that moment of near acceptance, I would say, to tweet over the weekend that, he won. He won because the election was rigged. Monday morning, he just wrote, "I won the election." And his administration is following suit, which is worrisome for the obvious reason. The peaceful transfer of power is obviously one of the most important aspects of our democracy. But separate from that is that it's a violation of the transfer of power laws that are in place to ensure that we have a smooth transition of power between presidencies. And perhaps most importantly is that almost every national security expert acknowledges that when administrations are changing, that is usually the point where our national security is the most vulnerable. That is, of course, exacerbated when the GSA won't certify the election and won't give access to President-elect Biden's transition team to access a lot of the privileged information relating to national security during this, crucial time period. The one thing that I will say that is helpful is that many people on the Biden transition team, and of course, Vice President Biden himself, were recently in those positions just 4 years ago. So they still do have a lot of contacts with administration officials now. They have a lot of experience about how this is supposed to happen, and they still have a lot of knowledge about what's going on with the US across the world. One of the other things that I think we need to think about in the lame duck is kind of how we see some of these frustrations play out. I think that there's a serious possibility that we'll see a flurry of executive orders on issues like immigration, for instance, or we could continue to see sort of blatant non-action on the part of the White House, which is particularly devastating now that we are at a point when the pandemic is essentially raging across the United States. And of course, in response to a lot of the president's tweets, we're seeing that they're sort of stoking anger and frustration among a lot of his supporters, which have been accused of violence in places like the district last weekend, and of course in Michigan as well. So the obvious remaining question mark here as we move forward is the makeup of the Senate. Heading into Election Day, Cook estimated the Democrats were going to pick up something like 2 to 7 seats. That obviously failed to materialize. By losing a seat in Alabama, they actually had only a net gain of 1. And obviously there are going to be runoffs in Georgia through next month and into January. Should Republicans keep the majority by winning the runoffs in Georgia, which is what most people expect, which is what I expect will happen, I think that we'll see, some return to fiscal conservatism, but generally speaking, I think there are a lot of opportunities for the Biden administration. Certainly, they're going to have to navigate big divisions in their own party. Already, I think that we're seeing moderates blaming progressives for losses in some key congressional races, progressives that are claiming responsibility for the Biden win. And I think one of the most important things that we need to acknowledge is that for the first time in 4 years, the more moderate wings of both parties are going to have to deal with the fact that they are no longer united by a common enemy. And I think that there's going to be some necessary fissures in the way that they think a lot of these reform policies should be designed. So I will stop there and cede my time to Geoff, who is going to dive in and talk a little bit more about the future of our parties.
Thanks very much, Kristie. Thank you, Kodiak. Thanks to everybody who's in attendance here. There's a lot of stories coming out of this election. Definitely trying to keep up with them has been drinking from the proverbial fire hose. I'm sure you all feel that way. And, the fact that this is taking place over Zoom rather than in some room where we're serving coffee and muffins to seated participants, says something about the unusual circumstances of the time. And, just on a personal note, it feels like I've been through a war. I'm sure we all kind of feel that way too. And we have, in a way. There's the Trump front and the pandemic front. I look into the screen and the 1,000-yard Zoom stare looks back at me. So anyway, strange times. I was trained as a historian, and I try to think, what is this election going to look like to future historians? All elections are, of course, historic occasions, but this feels historically historic, if I can put it that way. So let me just say what I think are probably some big takeaways that future historians might glean from this election. I think the first is just the unusual circumstances under which it took place. We are here on Zoom because of the pandemic in a week, I believe it's a week, when we had 1 million new cases diagnosed of the coronavirus. This is accelerating, I want to say, out of our control, although there are hopeful signs on the horizon, such as 2 companies coming forward with promising initiatives on vaccine tests. And of course, the pandemic is what has shaped the election itself with so many mail-in ballots and kind of determined a lot of what has followed. The other second thing is that Joe Biden won what I think is a significant and historic victory in the presidential contest. He flipped Arizona and Georgia. To quote Joe Biden from a different context, that's a big effing deal. These were long-held Republican and indeed conservative states. And to have taken back the blue wall in the Midwest and then have flipped these states is really quite significant. And we're in a situation right now where we are too close to the election. We are working with exit polls that are notoriously fallible. So any conclusions that we're going to draw from them right now are going to be tentative. It may be 2 years before we actually have a better analytic picture of who voted in this election and why they voted in this election. But it's clear that turnout was at extraordinarily high rates, both in the numbers, which are unprecedented, and in the participation rates, which I think takes us back to 1900 before you actually find an election in which you've had as high a percentage of the population turning out. And again, tentative hypotheses, but I think the record is going to show that Joe Biden succeeded in winning the presidency, partly on the strength of Georgia, let us say, where Stacey Abrams' role in accelerating minority turnout rates has to be saluted, but in large part because he won in the suburbs. And in particular, we're talking about the suburbs with large numbers of college-educated voters who previously had fairly reliably voted Republican. I think Will is itching to use some charts on these subjects, so I won't say too much more about that. But I think it's also worth noting that Joe Biden is probably going to emerge, maybe has emerged, with 306 electoral college votes and a popular vote margin of what's likely to be 6 to 7 million. Whereas Donald Trump won in the last election with the same number of electoral college votes and lost the popular election by nearly 3 million votes. So, we tend not to think of the United States as an old country. We love to cling to this belief that we're kind of a new, young, fresh, vibrant country, but we're actually working with some of the most archaic and antiquated and frankly outdated constitutional machinery of any existing country right now. And evidence of this is really starting to become quite obvious. The other notable thing about this election, one of the other notable things, is that although Biden won, a fairly historic record, given how difficult it is to unseat a sitting president, there was no mandate for his party, and he had no coattails to speak of. There had been an anticipation and indeed a massive polling failure predicting that there would be a big Democratic gain in the Senate and in the House and at the state level, and none of that happened. And again, we're still trying to sort out why exactly that is. But it does seem that in some parts of the country, at least, there was ballot splitting. And in other parts of the country, there was simply a perception that although Trump had to go, Democrats perhaps were too far left to be trusted with a mandate to do the kind of sweeping changes that they had been anticipating making. So the reality is that, we're in for a grinding kind of Congress, and this is a reminder that we are a divided country. And the likelihood is that if any kind of progress is going to be made in this next Congress, it's going to be a fairly incremental kind of progress, which is not entirely a bad thing, nor as a registered Republican am I entirely discouraged by these down ballot results. A lot of the places where Republican House candidates won were in those kind of purple and indeed some suburban districts that Democrats had flipped from pretty moderate Republicans in 2018. So just to cite one example from my home state, in Florida's 26th congressional district, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, who had won in 2018 as a Democrat, lost to Carlos Jimenez, who is the Republican mayor of Miami-Dade County. And this seat was previously held by Carlos Curbelo, who was a moderate Republican whom we all were very fond of and were sad when he lost on the Republican side. So, likelihood is pretty good that Carlos Jimenez is going to be a moderate Republican, much in the Carlos Curbelo mold. He is from a district, and now will be the new representative from a district that is 70% Hispanic, which is at least one of the leading districts in the country, maybe the leading district in terms of the number of citizens who benefit from Obamacare. And he himself, as a regional leader, as a kind of mayor, has demonstrated the kind of practical give and take of politics that doesn't really work so well at the federal level, but still seems to be working in a lot of localities. And he actually, represents a low-lying coastal district that is on the forefront of changes brought about by climate change. And he's well aware of that and wants to work with Democrats on that issue. He wants to work with Democrats on the resolution of legal status for the Dreamers and other immigration-related issues. And he's concerned about the situation of urban areas as well. So, it's perhaps disappointing for some Democrats that a lot of their candidates were removed in this election when they had hoped to make gains, but this doesn't necessarily mean that all hopes for progress are gone. Also interesting on the Republican side is that there was apparently a big shift among Hispanics in at least some states and some areas toward the Republican Party, even some Black voters. Again, a little bit of hesitation about relying too much on exit polls, but at this point, it appears that Trump gained with every demographic group in the country except white men. And if this is what you thought anyone was predicting going into the election, you would be wrong. This is going to be mystifying, again, to a lot of these future historians. How would Trump, making these racist pronouncements, playing upon white resentment, actually gain among minorities? Again, I don't know what the future historians will judge here, but I think some of this, again, is the realization that we're very slowly coming to, much belatedly, that no community in America, especially no racial or ethnic community, is a monolith. And every community contains within itself a wide range of ideological positions and just sort of thoughts on a lot of different issues. And it is senseless to speak of the Hispanic vote. One can speak of Hispanic votes and voters and particular Hispanic communities. So obviously Miami has a pretty high rate of Cuban American voters, and their particular circumstances, fleeing a communist dictatorship, or at least having their forebears flee a communist dictatorship, has something to do with it. One can argue the same about Venezuelan voters. And it also has to be noted that this is simply not uniform across the country. Joe Biden won Arizona in large part thanks to high rates of support from Hispanic voters. But apparently there was something about the message that Democrats and even the seemingly inoffensive and anodyne figure of Joe Biden are going to bring socialism to the United States that worked with these voters. And again, maybe it wasn't anything to do with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's kind of being held up as sort of a demon figure. Maybe it was simply the chaos that seemed to grip the country for much of the summer following George Floyd's death at the hand of police in Minneapolis. Maybe it was simply like the aura of instability and chaos that came from the tearing down of statues and other episodes one might point to. But at any rate, again, maybe a positive of this result, but Republicans can realize that they are not doomed to be a minoritarian party that must repress votes to win elections. Maybe they can actually understand that the country is changing. They can go with this. They can make conservative appeals to minority communities, and that this may work. And then a final point I think that will again be of interest to historians is that the reason Joe Biden is not being uniformly hailed as the president, and the GSA is not transitioning to the Biden administration, is because Donald Trump is engaging in the monstrous lie that there was widespread electoral fraud that cost him the election, and that the Democrats stole the election, and that therefore Joe Biden, if he becomes president, is illegitimate. And he is being indulged in this complete and absurd fantasy by an entire political party, with a few honorable exceptions. Given that much of the strategy here for the Republican Party, to the extent there is a strategy, rests on throwing out hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of votes, and having the Supreme Court decide the election against the popular will, really means that we are closer to authoritarianism than we have ever been in any of our lifetimes. So anyway, that's pretty significant, I think, and it's going to seem like a big effing deal to the historians of the future. And with that, I turn it over to Will.
Good morning. I'm glad you all could join us. I think both Kristie and Geoff did a great job covering some of the basics. I will repeat maybe a little bit of what Geoff said, but I want to, first of all, give a little update on the connection between party vote share and population density, which was a big story in 2016 and continues to be a big story this year. I wrote a paper last year, which I encourage you to check out. It's called The Density Divide, Urbanization, Polarization, and Populist Backlash. And one of the most just really striking features of the American electorate is that there's a very close correlation between partisan vote share and population density. And what does that mean? It means that if you start in any city, the closer you are to the historic core of the city, the denser the population is packed. You'll have more people per square mile. And the more people per square mile you have, the higher the Democratic vote share, the better Democrats do. And if you just started from like City Hall or the historic downtown, and you started just driving out toward the countryside, as population density decreases, so does Democratic vote share. At a certain point in the suburbs, you get the 50-50 point where the electorate is pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And then if you go past that point, Republicans start to dominate, and the further out you go, the higher Republican vote share. I'm going to show you a couple pictures just to make this, it's easier to visualize when you actually visualize it. So I'm going to share my screen here for a second. Is that visible here? All right, here's a picture. This comes from the New York Times with its election results. This is the Atlanta metro area. And you can see that, you know, right here in the downtown Atlanta, in the core of the city, it's just this real mass of blue voters. And you can almost see the edge where, right here in the suburbs, where Democratic precincts start to give way to Republican precincts. That is the density divide right there. And it is incredibly consistent. It's not just big cities. It's smaller towns. My hometown, Marshalltown, Iowa, is 27,000 people. You still see the same thing. The Democratic vote share is highest right in downtown, and it becomes more Republican the further out you go. So this is an interesting fact of the world, that we are polarized on population density. And my paper gives a very long explanation of that. In short, the explanation is that population density correlates with a bunch of other things that correlate with party affiliation. White versus non-white ethnicity, different personality types that correlate with social conservatism versus social liberalism, level of education, and finally, just the level of economic output of an area. All of these things are connected. The vast majority of America's non-white population lives in relatively big cities, either in the urban core or in the suburbs. Non-white voters are increasingly suburban, which has something to do with the shifts of some suburbs in this election. Educated voters, people with a 4-year degree or a professional and graduate degree, are extremely likely to live in a large metro. There's a wage bonus to a higher level of education, but to cash in on that, you have to go to a labor market that which has a demand for those particular skills. Those are all urban. So basically, if you get a college education, you have to move to a city. And that is also a big part of this story. There's a huge, the population of Americans with a 4-year degree is very, very, very heavily concentrated in suburban areas. And then finally, because economic output correlates with the skill level of the workers in the economy, better educated places tend to have higher economic output. And this is one of the most stark parts of the divide. This is a big part of the story. Last time, in 2016, counties that favored Hillary Clinton accounted for 64% of GDP. Right? That's almost 2/3 of economic output. And that has become even more striking in the 2020 election. Democratic-leaning counties now account for 70% of GDP. Right? So the picture is kind of clearest when you think about who lives in the Republican counties. Right? It is almost entirely white voters. We saw some change in that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's mostly white. It's mostly people who have the personality types that correlate with social conservatism. That's slightly higher conscientiousness, as the personality psychologists call it. But more significantly, a lower level of openness to experience. Openness to experience is the trait that most strongly correlates with whether you have liberal or conservative views on social issues, but it also correlates with a bunch of other stuff, like whether you're likely to migrate, right? People who are lower in openness to experience are more rooted. They like to stay around the people that they grew up with, their family. They're very loyal. That's part of their ethos. People who are lower in openness to experience are also less intrinsically motivated to travel, try new foods, but most significantly to get education just because they're interested in learning about the world. So people who are lower in openness to experience are less likely to go to college. And you see that throughout the lower density areas of the country where the average level of education tends to be lower. And that correlates very significantly with stagnating or declining economic output. So people in the Republican areas of the country have been experiencing pretty serious economic stagnation over the longer term, which makes them kind of angry. And there's a bunch of reasons for that that I won't go into. Okay, so overall the shifts this time, right? Even though the correlation holds up between density and vote share, it's not because everything stayed the same, right? So Trump made real gains in urban cores because, as Geoff mentioned, he made some inroads with non-white voters, and non-white voters are very heavily concentrated in urban cores, especially Black voters and Hispanic voters who are working class. Let's see. Let me show you. Do I have a picture of that? All right. I don't think I have a picture of that. Here's a picture of the swings, right? So there was the counties did shift, but it led things to stay mostly the same. So Trump made gains in a lot of big cities, and you can see that over here. Large metro counties, 71% swung to Democrats. But if you look over here, you can see some of these big bubbles on the red side, and way over here too. Some of them, that's probably Miami, where Trump gained in a lot of these bigger cities. That is a gain from an incredibly low vote share to begin with, right? So he wasn't getting much. He got a bit more, which is a big gain. But he had even larger gains in rural counties, for the most part. So you see over here, 54 of these counties swung Republican, and so those were counties that were already voting Republican, and more than half of them swung. So overall, the general correlation is about the same, right, between density and vote share. If there hadn't been any swing in the urban area, it would have gotten a lot worse. And if there hadn't been any swing in the country, in the rural areas, the density divide would have kind of shrunk, but it's staying pretty much the same. But the biggest story is there is a giant shift in suburban counties. That is, most of the American population lives in what are classified as suburbs. And you can see that 63% of medium and small counties shifted to Democrats, and then large metro counties, which include the suburban counties of the biggest cities, shifted very heavily to Democrats. So that's the overall picture. The issue of Hispanic vote share shifting is really, really interesting. I don't think we have a good answer to that yet, like an answer to, why that has happened. There's a lot of speculation, like working class guys are attracted to Trump's machismo or something. I don't know about that. There's probably something to it. To me, just at a first glance, and again, this is speculative, it looks like some of the same dynamics are opening up with respect to non-white populations. So there was a real shift. There's a real correlation that we see, at least given the way the exit polls look right now, between shift toward Trump and the percentage of a county's population that is Hispanic. So the more Hispanic the county in terms of the percentage of the population being Hispanic, the more it shifted to Trump. And a lot of those counties, so the big story that we're seeing is, like people are really remarking on Miami and places where there's a lot of votes. But looking at some of these maps, a lot of the shifts are in heavily Hispanic rural counties, right? And so you're going to get some of the same dynamics where the personality types that tend to be more conservative like to live in lower density areas, and they also like to live around people who are like them. So if you see relatively homogenous populations, it's more likely to be more ethnocentric, which is correlated with lower openness to experience. And more ethnocentric Hispanics are also more likely to be conservative in their general political inclinations. So it's a complicated story. I don't think we know quite what is going on. A lot of Democrats have some big questions about, like, why didn't we do better, right? Like, so this was, a lot of the post-election commentary is people just absolutely befuddled that you could have a president who is effectively responsible for killing about 150,000 people through negligence, right? Like the COVID policy has been an utter disaster. People are dying by droves. The economy is stagnated because of, people can't go to work. You can't go to the movies, blah, blah, blah. But it seems like Trump didn't get dinged much for that, even though I think it probably did lose him the election. When you look at which issues voters said were the highest priority for them, more voters said coronavirus response was their highest priority. That was 41% of voters said that was the top priority. And Biden just absolutely obliterated Trump with those voters. It was like 71 to 19% or something like that. And the next highest priority issue was the performance of the economy. That was only 24% of the voters or whatnot. Trump did better on that, but there weren't nearly as many people who prioritized that. So just looking at that kind of thing, it does suggest that the bad response to the pandemic may have cost Trump the election. The interesting thing is that clearly didn't lead voters to punish down-ticket Republicans for their complicity in positive contribution to the denialist, open it all up, it's just going to go away sort of response, right? They weren't held responsible. And there's a real question why that is. So like a lot of Democrats are like, why didn't we do better? And so a bunch of moderates have said, oh, it's because, like AOC insists on talking about the Green New Deal and defund the police and socialism, blah, blah, blah. Maybe there's something to that. Although it is the case that Democrats picked up their biggest pickups were white people in the suburbs in the most moderate districts. So their losses weren't with people who are what you would think of as the swing voters necessarily. So that's interesting. I think the explanation is actually pretty simple. It's that the electorate really is incredibly polarized. And when an electorate is pretty evenly split in terms of like more or less 50-50, here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. When it's more or less evenly split and people are really, really polarized, it's just people don't inhabit the same universe. Right? It's really easy. And Trump has been really good at exploiting this. He's done a great job of cleaving Republicans off from any source of information that is unfavorable to him. And you see these giant divides in terms of how serious Democrats versus Republicans think the pandemic is. And it's just a general thing that political scientists have found. The worse polarization gets, the less the electorate is explained by what they call retrospective or sociotropic voting. It's not like voters look at, like what actually happened? How did this guy perform? And then they either endorse the incumbent or try to kick them out based on bad performance or good performance, because perceptions of how well they did are just so divided by party that there isn't any clear take in the electorate about whether they did a good or bad job. Democrats think the electorate is, I'm sorry, Democrats think that the economy is doing lousy when a Republican is in charge, and vice versa, right? So mostly it's just that Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans. That's the main part of the story. But there was some clearly retrospective voting, because I think Trump did get punished for the bad coronavirus response, just not as much as you might expect, but it was enough. But the other aspect of it is that I think Trump got credit for the strength of the economy prior to the pandemic setting in. Trump's economy was doing extremely well. Like, he was relentlessly doing everything he could to goose the economy in the way that like kind of tin pot authoritarians do. They just want as much stimulus as they can get. They're gonna strong arm the central bank to make sure that they don't tighten up. They want the money to stay easy, and that was all working. The economy was going pretty well. The labor market was incredibly tight, which was making sure that people who otherwise couldn't have gotten a job were getting hired, getting trained. It was going really, really well for people all up and down the income distribution. And he was really happy about that. He thought he was going to coast to re-election on the strength of that, and I think he would have. He hit the pandemic, he screwed up incredibly, but his strategy was just to ignore it. It's not real. It's not real. It's going to go away. And then he effectively set a trap for Democrats that didn't know how to get out of, which is that just partly because of this polarizing effect, Republican partisans would agree with him that it wasn't that big of a deal. And then they would agree with him that the economy was doing so poorly because Democratic governors and mayors were shutting it down just to hurt his reelection chances, right? And so the poor performance of the economy wasn't attributed to Trump. It was attributed to overreaction by opportunistic, scaredy cat Democrats. And part of the effect of that is that, like, once you've done nothing and the epidemic is just completely out of control, you can say, like Biden did, that he knew it was going to do this, that it's his fault that the economy is tanking. But like, it doesn't help you if you're, a working class family who just has to go to work or else your kids aren't going to eat. It doesn't help you to be told that it's his fault. Right? You liked it. You want to work. And the guy who says, I think we ought to open up the economy, that is giving you an appealing message. And I think that was especially appealing with a lot of non-white working class voters who, if you were a 2-income Hispanic family in a big city and the schools aren't open, what are you supposed to do with your kids? Right? I think Democrats did a horrible job in dealing with those issues, and it really hurt them. And it basically ensured that Trump led all across the board in terms of opinions on who was better on the economy. And so that is my sort of long-winded explanation for why Republicans didn't do better. And now that I appear to have the coronavirus, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Geoff and Kristie and Will, for your thoughtful commentary. While we wait for some questions to roll in, I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative and ask a few of my own questions. But one of the things I want to make a point about, and I think all of my colleagues sort of in their own ways touched on this, but one of the most surprising elements in this cycle was actually the number of Republican women elected to the House. We started 2020 with 13 female members of the House Republican Conference, and it looks like we're on track to have more than 20 in the 117th Congress. And I think this is just, it's just important to note that this is kind of a big historic change. We might actually, there's some races that are still undecided, but we might actually see a record-breaking number of Republican women elected this cycle and joining the 117th. So I think that that's kind of the sub-element of a lot of the conversation, that some of the most contentious districts, some of the hardest to flip, those moderate districts that flipped in 2018 and are now kind of considered purple, actually in this instance turned out for the Republican female candidate. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about that is the amount of ballot splitting that we saw. And I think each of my colleagues touched on this, and I'd love to dig into a little bit more. This is a conversation that Geoff Kabaservice and I have certainly had. And it's something that it's a trend that just has really been dying out, and then all of a sudden seems to have had a resurgence in this cycle. And I think it's really interesting that you may have had voters who are traditionally more Republican voters who are willing to pull the lever or mail in the ballot for Joe Biden, but then vote Republican down ballot. Geoff, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about this. It's certainly one of the most interesting elements, I think, of this cycle.
Well, thanks, Kodiak. You're actually far better qualified than I am to talk about the women angle and why women, number one, got recruited in greater numbers this year to run as Republicans, and then why they won. I think that, again, is interesting and significant. Ballot ticket splitting is something that we've been told is dead. And it seems at odds with this idea that we're all completely polarized now. Let me just throw out one hypothesis there, which I can't even begin to answer. But, suppose it is that the realignment that matters most in electoral politics is not the populist realignment we've been hearing so much about, but the realignment of the college-educated middle class away from Republicans and into the Democratic column. We talk about the Reagan Democrats of the 1980s. And maybe it is that, again, those future historians will talk about the Biden Republicans of this particular era. But the thing about the Reagan Democrats is that they started voting for the president without quite giving up their identity as Democrats for a long time after that. It really wasn't until, the Newt Gingrich election as as House Speaker in 1994, the election that brought him to that position, that you actually saw an alignment of these voters' presidential picks and their congressional picks. And maybe that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah, and if I may sort of piggyback on Geoff's comments, I think this again speaks to the complexity of voters that I think that we're starting to see, especially in non-white voters, that both Will and Geoff touched on. And I think it's especially apparent in the Hispanic and Latino voters that everyone sort of assumed was going to be this monolith. And we saw the socialist, stoking the fear, the fear that Trump was stoking in this idea that we were going to have, a socialist government really resonated with Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans in South Florida. But then we saw a fair number of Mexican Americans in the Rio Grande Valley and more rural areas of Texas that were really worried about losing some of their high-paying jobs in the oil industry. And then kind of out of nowhere, we saw a huge percentage of Latino voters in Maricopa County basically carry Arizona for the Democrats. So I think that we're really starting to see a lot more complexity in some of these voters. And it's not just that they are voting on one issue anymore. It's not that, Latinos are going to consistently vote for Democrats or Republicans because they're, against some of the more lax abortion laws, for instance. A lot of them are starting to see, I think that we are starting to see, at least as a result of some of these exit polls. And I too am hesitant, like Geoff, to rely on a lot of the data coming out of exit polls. I think that we'll see a lot more clarity in future months. But I think that it is demonstrative that this is a much more diverse field of views than I think anyone really wanted to acknowledge prior to the election. I think that so many people were so desperate to see this be a vote about the president's policies, especially in the last year relating to coronavirus, that we were a little bit blindsided by some of the actual issues that people were concerned about.
If I can jump in there, on the ticket splitting, I think it's the issue is, to me, is largely that party affiliation has become more and more a part of people's identity. There's a great book by Liliana Mason, a political scientist at the University of Maryland, called Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity, or something like that. And so our polarization isn't just like changes in our views. It has to do with people integrating their, political preferences more deeply into their self-definition and the kind of meaning that they confer on their life. So it's persuasion, like party flipping persuasion, becomes very hard under those conditions, because you're not just asking somebody to hey, these views are better. Don't you want to vote for the party or the candidate who has views that are closer to yours, right? Like, because it's not that people have views that are independent of their partisan identity. They have the views they do because they have that partisan identity for the most part. And so it's a big ask to try to get people to cross the aisle. And to me, the really remarkable thing is that so many people did cross over to vote against Trump. That actually does show that there is a really strong repudiation of his presidency. The gap that we see between Trump's performance and other Republicans' performance actually is an index of disenchantment and dismay over the Trump presidency. So but because that's not easy. It's not easy for people to vote against their party. And so I think if you were expecting more Republicans to vote against Trump and also vote against all of his enablers in the party, what you're doing is asking them to reassess who they are, which is too much to ask. It was easy enough for people to be like, this guy is, a one-off bozo who is ruining the country. I want him gone. But I also want to reaffirm my identity as a Republican. Like, I'm not a Democrat, right? Like, I'm going to vote for the Republican Senate candidate. And I think that's just most of what it is. It's not so much a question of Democrats failing to position themselves right or whatever. It's just that Republicans don't want to vote against Republicans. And the fact that so many of them voted against the Republican president is a big success for those of us who have been trying to get those Republicans to vote against the president.
Well, thank you all for indulging me in answering my question. And in fact, Will, one of the questions that we have coming from our attendees, I think really speaks to the point that you were just making. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to kick it to you, because I think you're the best equipped to answer this. So Phil Rose asks, once Trump set the trap that the downturn was caused by Dems, how could Dems have responded that would have worked better for them?
I think they needed more coherent messaging, and they just didn't have it. So they needed to be clearer, first of all, about what the administration should be doing, right? And they just weren't. Right? I was working for a number of months on coronavirus policy, trying to get a very large-scale testing, tracing, and supported isolation program in place. I wasn't hearing about that from Democratic leaders. I wasn't, right? This is what, they should have been saying, Canada's doing great. Like, we should do what Canada's doing. New Zealand is doing great. We should be doing what New Zealand is doing. And they oddly weren't. I don't understand that, personally. And then secondarily, they needed to understand that just assigning blame doesn't solve anybody's problem. And they needed to take those problems a lot more seriously. And this is a case where I really think the Democratic Party was hurt by its I don't know what the right word is, like obeisance to teachers unions, for example, right? Like, people want schools to be open. As a parent, it's just like utter freaking misery to have your kids at home all the time. And I'm like the kind of person who could sit in my basement and work from home like I'm doing now. It's a huge problem if you have to go, work as a sous chef at a local restaurant, or if you have to clean hotel rooms. Like, who's going to take care of your kids? Right? Like, you need schools to be open. But Democrats were very hesitant about like pushing on schools opening, despite the fact that it's really, really true that kids are much less likely to get it. They're much less likely to spread it, right? Like, it's not a zero risk, but like, they didn't deal with it well. And then the other part of the trap that Trump and McConnell set was basically by refusing to do a last relief bill, the economic screws on states and municipalities were so tight that those places couldn't afford not to keep bars and restaurants open and stuff like that. So you had all sorts of places making all the wrong choices, even though Democrats were in charge. They were opening the restaurants but keeping the schools closed. It doesn't make any sense from an epidemiological perspective, an economic perspective, from the perspective of anybody's life, except people who own businesses and people who like work at those businesses, but mostly from state and city officials who need the revenue to like keep the lights on, right? Like, so they didn't know how to get out of that trap. I think they really did get stuck in it. And so they needed to just be more coordinated, be more coherent, have a clearer message. They really did need to do everything possible to get schools open, to roll open businesses in a saner sequence. And they just didn't do it. I think they did a bad job, and they paid the price for it.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists, my colleagues. It is always a pleasure to do these webinars. I end up learning so much. And thank you to all of our attendees. We know that your Zoom schedules get pretty busy, so spending your morning with us is greatly appreciated. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. And Will actually mentioned a paper that he'd written. We encourage you to check out the niskanencenter.org website for his density divide paper. Thanks to everyone. Stay safe and stay well.